Die Sprachübertragung beginnt jetzt. Alle Teilnehmer befinden sich im Zuhörermodus.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to wait 2 minutes because people are still joining, and then we'll get started. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so we're now a couple of minutes past the hour, so in order to joined on time, I think it's important that we get started if people are still joining. Then what we've got first of all is just a couple of questions that the team have asked me to ask you via the poll mechanism on this webinar, just so that we can get a feel for our attendees today. This is nothing to do with the talk today. There will be some questions around the talk, but just to get us started, the first thing we'd like to know is about Ask Data. So you can see the question there on your screen. If you just take a couple of minutes to answer that, do you know about Ask Data from Tableau? Okay, and just looking at the results, 92% of you voted, and it was a not too close thing. Most of the next question we had just before we get started with the talk was around the data catalog. How well are Tableau doing at letting you know about the data catalog from Tableau? Okay, we've worked some of you up there. 95% of you voted this time, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it's a slightly newer feature that is now coming out in beta. The results are that only 39% of you kind of swapped round from the previous poll. So we'll use that to determine what talks we should do in future. But now on with the show. Let me share my screen and get this presentation started. So, how to lie with charts, and before I get started, I wanted to make sure I hit the record button, so I will make sure we're recording. We are recording. So I wanted to share a story before we get started, and that's a story from an event that I did last year. It was what was called a BI bake-off. This is me in action. I had to build a chart Iron Viz style against two other technologies. I was using Tableau, and there was a couple of other technologies in the room. We had 20 minutes to build out some charts and then present them back to the audience. Very much if you've seen Iron Viz at the Tableau conference. these are my other competitors. And during the presentations, one of my fellow competitors shared a chart that looked like this. Apologies for the poor quality, but they were telling a story about how male and female esports competitors over time had got closer and closer by a year. And this was a room full of professionals. This was a professional speaker giving the talk. And what the room and what that competitor didn't pick up on was the fact that if you look at the axis down the bottom, then the years are all out of order. This chart isn't actually telling us the story that we think it is. The data is ordered by year, by the number of female competitors, and therefore the years are out of order, and we're seeing what we want to see. And this really brought home the fact that in that professional audience, the competitor, and this was an accidental mistake, by the way, we were under pressure. We had 20 minutes to draw charts, so I'm not casting any aspersions on anybody, but it's so easy to make mistakes. But in that professional audience, no one picked up on it, and the competitor didn't pick up on it. And if those kind of people at the top of their game can make these mistakes, then we all can. And that's really what got me thinking about how do we lie with charts? How do we spot a liar, and how do we avoid making mistakes? How do we critically analyze what we do to make sure that we're not being lied to in the media, that we're making ethical decisions when we're charting, and we're not misleading people? And that's really the so what that I took from this. So who am I? Who is this guy who comes and says he's been competing in this great competition? Well, my name's Chris Love. I'm a Tableau Zen master. I work for the UK region of the Information Lab out of Nottingham. I work in our London office. And I'm here today just to talk to you about this subject. This is a subject that really gets me passionate, but I'd like to know kind of what you think is, if we go back to the poll, what you think is your most important area. So if you look at the poll now, what's the most important, the biggest issue in your division? I think the area of data literacy and data ethics are most important, but I'd love to know what you think is most important. And some really interesting results coming in. Thank you for voting. And just sharing those results. 42% of you agree with me. I mean, perhaps I've sowed some seeds around that. I don't know. The others are fairly evenly split. So thank you for that. Back to the presentation then. It looks like you're at the right talk, which is fantastic. So this is me. Let me just close this, get my mouse back. So before I start talking about how we lie with charts and how to spot people who are perhaps lying with charts and how to avoid those mistakes, I think it's worth taking a step back to data visualization 101 and remember why we visualize data. Hopefully this video will work. There we go. So I've got a quick test for you. You will see a number of circles flash on the screen for a very short period of time. And then I'm going to ask you about the circles afterwards. This is a video you can find on YouTube. Now, did you see the red circle among the blue dots? Let's do that test again, but with a different scene. And I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. So pay attention. Now, this time, did you see the red square among the red circles? It was there, but it was perhaps slightly harder. And then the third one, if I just zoom forward, did you see the red rectangle among all the red and blue squares and circles? Almost definitely not, I think. So what does that tell us? Oops. What does that tell us about data visualization? It tells us that our brain is set up for what to call pre-attentive attributes. Those colors that we saw, those shapes are what we call pre-attentive attributes. They're things that our brain is able to process in that 1/10 or less of a second before you've even consciously looked for a red circle. You've been able to spot that outlier because our brains are programmed to do that. It's an innate ability that our brains have. And it was much harder to see some of the other attributes like the rectangle among the squares or the shape among the square among the circles. And visual analytics really takes the view, and this is Andy Kirk's definition of visual analytics. Visual analytics takes the view that it's the representation and presentation of data that exploits our visual perception abilities in order to amplify cognition. Now, there's two really important parts there. I've already talked about visual analytics exploiting our visual perception abilities, exploiting those abilities that become innate, those pre-attentive processing abilities. But it's also really important that we do that in order to amplify the understanding of our audience. If we're not amplifying the understanding of our audience, then that's not visual analytics. That's what we call data art. We're doing it just for the hell of it, just to make pretty things. So those two things really need to go hand in hand. Let's show this in an example. I've got an array of numbers here, and I'm just going to ask you to count the number of 9s. That's a pretty difficult task, isn't it? So I can make that easy for you using pre-attentive attributes, in this case, color. Now it's much easier to count the number of 9s. There are 10 of them. I've literally just scanned over that and counted them here and now. So that color makes it so easy. It makes our pre-attentive attributes really easy to stand out. We're faster when we can see data. We know this. This is why we do data visualization. We're starting off at a really simple level here, but spot the lowest number in this table. Again, it's quite difficult. We have to scan every number. We have to try and spot those minus numbers. I can make it easier for you again using color. That's a key pre-attentive attribute, and perhaps we can scan all those red numbers and spot that this 43 just here is the one that is the most unprofitable. But it's still not easy. I've still got to scan all those red numbers. What if I want a way of using pre-attentive attributes to find comparatively to all the others? Well, that's where we can use the length of bars. We can spot the highest very quickly just looking at the length of bars. It's one of those two, and it's definitely that one. We can spot the lowest. This one stands out because of that red pre-attentive attribute and the length of that bar. So using pre-attentive attributes, we can make ourselves faster at seeing data. That is what visual analytics is. It's using those elements of our brain, those innate abilities to see data and amplify our cognition of those data points. These are the pre-attentive visual attributes. We've got everything from color, which we've talked about. We can use the hue or the intensity just here. We've got enclosing data, the data that we use in scatter plots. We've got shape, we've got size, orientations, widths and lengths. Now, each of those has its own level at which our brains are good at spotting those pre-attentive visual attributes. I tend to put them in this order. We tend to prefer to put data on position first, followed by color, followed by size, followed by shape. If you think about a scatter plot, the two most important measures in a scatter plot should be on the X and Y axis. We're taking advantage of our ability to spot the position of something very quickly. After that, the color should be the next most important measure, followed by the size of the dots, followed by, if you really need to put a lot of information on a scatter plot, then use the shape to differentiate those elements. This is why it's our brain's ability to process that data. We can see a very quick example of that when we look at a bar chart versus these two other elements. The top bar chart shows two different products. Product A is around 75, product B is 30. So product A is about 2.5 times bigger than A. And we can see that from the bar chart almost instantly. I don't know why I can see that from the two color hues. Product A, can I definitely say that this is 2.5 times more dark blue than this one? No, we can't judge that comparativeness as easy. Likewise, if I asked you how much bigger is A than B, you can see it's perhaps twice as big. Some people might say 4 times as big. It's very difficult to try and compare that. So again, you know, if you're using comparative measures, then use bar charts. That's what they're there for. They're there for comparing things. Which brings us on to how to lie with charts. I don't want to teach you how to lie with charts. You know, this isn't the aim of the session. I'd hope no one goes away and goes, excellent, we can fool our marketing department with these clever tricks. No, what we're doing is hopefully teaching you how to spot liars, how to be more aware of what you're presenting so that you don't make accidental mistakes with charts, and also you can help spot these when they're in the media and other things. So let's look at a few examples of how people accidentally and sometimes deliberately lie with charts. Here's a chart that might be presented. This is using Superstore sales data, and we can see that sales from February to December have been rising. I can tell a great story to my boss about how our new marketing promotion has helped our sales. I can present this to him and know that he's going to get a great story out of this. This is called selective framing, though. What have I done to present this to my boss? I've actually taken the last chunk of this data from here, and I've just presented what is actually an annual trend. My boss might be clever and call me out on this. He or she might be able to say, well, look, this always happens every January to December. So what we're seeing isn't an overall trend that's down to the marketing campaign. This is just something that we need to spot. We can't selectively take this data and choose it to tell the stories that we want. Using an appropriate time frame to tell the story is really important when we're looking at charts. And this is something that happens in the media all the time. This is a source from BEA. This is the average economic growth under Obama, 2009 to 2016 in the US. Economic growth was only 1.4%, whereas in the preceding years it was well up there at 3.5%. This is selective framing. The author of this chart has chosen those time periods in order to frame the conversation and give the results that they wanted. If we actually look at the data, we can see that actually the real percentage change in that has been going down steadily from 1950 to all the way to 2009, and this is just a continuation, perhaps with that little bump in 2009 contributing. We're selectively choosing to take this period and take the average versus this one, which changes the story dramatically. Another example of lying with charts, and this is perhaps one you'll all be familiar with. Here we could say technology is doing absolutely fantastic. Technology is winning the day. Except if you're savvy and you can kind of pay attention to the axis, you'll see that no, technology isn't 4 times bigger than furniture. We've actually just cut off the axis and it's actually only perhaps 100,000 more. If we look at the full data set, you can see the real story without using these shortened axes is very different. Again, this is a trick that's often used in the media. On election leaflets that get pushed through the door. Here you can see this is actually a Liberal Democrat leaflet saying that it's a 2-horse race. The Conservatives can't win. Now, whether they can or not is debatable, but they've actually shortened the axis. They've cut this off, and this isn't that much higher. This is only about twice, little over twice as high as this, but the axis has been shortened to do that. Okay, so be careful about shortening your axes. Always watch out for them when you're looking for charts in the media or from your colleagues, because it's really an easy way to spot how people are lying. It's not a definitive rule. It's almost definitive with bar charts. With line charts, similarly, so dot plots, you can shorten the axis because people aren't looking at the length. If we go back, they're not looking at the length, this pre-attentive attribute, to judge this. If this is a dot just here, they're looking at where it fits on the axis. So if these were dots, personally, I think this would be okay. It's the length of the bar, which is a pre-attentive attribute that we automatically encode to this. Likewise, with a line chart, it's not always cut and dried. There's a certain view that maybe if you've got something that can't go down to 0, let's say we're looking at weight or the 100-meter record, which was a famous example used by Andy Cotgrave. If you're looking at the time taken to complete 100 meters or my weight, there is no physical way that can go down to 0. So maybe it's okay to cut that line chart as we describe the progression of my weight, hopefully going down, or the 100-meter record, hopefully going down. We can see that is reducing, but we don't need to do that with respect to naught. So watch out for those, but don't think that these are hard and fast rules. I can also tell stories using 2 axes. Here where we see that sales have really taken off, sales in orange have really taken off with regards to profit. I can tell a great story about that. Why is profit not increasing when our sales are increasing? There's clearly something wrong. Or maybe I can tell the story that they're both increasing at exactly the same rate. This is exactly the same data as this. What I've done is change the axes on the right-hand side to frame that slightly differently. I could also say that in a similar way, sales have massively increased and profit is only just catching up. These are all the same data and I'm getting different stories out of it. This is the problem with dual axes. So if you're using dual axes, be careful that you're comparing apples and oranges and not framing the story in the way that you need to. One way of doing that is to use scatter plots. This is a connected scatter plot. We we put the sales on the y-axis and the profit on the x-axis, and then join the points up according to the time. Now, this isn't for all audiences. This is a chart that's quite difficult to understand and needs some level of data literacy in order to view. But if we see here, we can see that sales have gone slightly down between 2016, while profit has increased. Now, up here, we see both are increasing in line, and then again, sales increases slightly faster than profit does compared with this period. So we can suddenly tell a story that is true to that data by connecting these two things up. Another way of telling this same story is to compare them both compared to their 2015 baseline. And we can see the percentage change in profit versus that baseline. So profit has increased up to 90% since this baseline. Sales has only increased 50%. We can do this with the year-on-year percentage change quick table calculation in Tableau. It's a very quick thing to do. But rather than using dual axes, this is perhaps a better way to go. This is used in the media, perhaps in a similar way to what we call spurious correlations. This is Hillary Clinton's approval rate compared to the US unemployment rate. There's a great website called Spurious Correlations, which you can look up to see lots of these kind of really wacky examples. Of course, Hillary Clinton hasn't affected the US employment rate, but it's easy to frame that way by looking for correlations that aren't there. One last example of ways you can lie with charts. We can ignore other factors. These are the most dangerous cities in the US. Total murders in 2014, and we can see that Chicago is by far the most dangerous city. New York comes just after it, followed by Detroit, etc. Or is it? Is there something we're missing here? And of course, what we're missing here is the murder rate is very different to the actual number of murders. Chicago has many more people than some of these other places. Therefore, of course, we'd expect there to be more murders. In fact, if we just look at the murder rate, so the murders per 100,000 people, then we can see that Detroit has the most murders, followed by New Orleans, and Chicago doesn't even feature in that top 5. It's a very different story, but it's an important one to get those other factors factored into our analysis. So I'm going to move on to tell you a story about how a worked example of how I got it wrong. And we'll use that to frame how we look at data critically and dive into this. But before we do, I'm interested, back to the poll again. How well equipped are your staff to critically analyze data? That doesn't look like it's working actually. We shared this just before to test it, so it looks like it's not working. So apologies for that. I'll go back to my talk. I think it's interesting how much our staff are equipped for this, and I think there's a big education piece that we need to do to people around how do we analyze data critically, and I'd love to start conversations around this on how do we teach this and how do we get people more equipped to critically analyze what they're looking at and ask appropriate questions. This is a big data literacy topic, and it's one that we're happy to have those conversations with you. None of us are infallible, and I certainly got it wrong last year when I was looking at some data. This was an example from Makeover Monday, and it was looking at the land use per gram of protein of different food types. And we can see that beef and mutton uses a lot more land to produce a gram of protein than pork and produce, and pulses is right down here. This was the source of data, and it was something that I looked at, and I started looking at this, and I saw that this was meter squared per gram of protein. So I produced a chart and squared those numbers, because I thought that a meter, well, we needed to square that to get an area of how much these are producing. So we could see that the beef more than the pork, etc. I also produced this this visualization. It's actually a visualization you need to scroll right a long way to see how many pulses you need to get in order to get the same protein as each of the same as 1 gram of protein as each of these different food types. Turns out you need about I thought you needed about 9,000 pulses before you could get to 1 gram of the same protein in beef. But I've got this wrong. I was actually squaring this data when I didn't need to. And lots of other people made very similar mistakes. People would say we're dividing these numbers up and saying that the land use, 88% of this land use goes towards making food for animals, or dividing these numbers up equally, 1 gram each, and saying these are the various percentages that land use contributes across the world. Now, clearly, we're ignoring the other factors here. We're ignoring how much land actually goes towards producing beef, because people eat different amounts of these. So land use doesn't necessarily contribute to how much per 1 gram of protein this food contributes. So it's very easy to make mistakes around this. I could have spotted this. I could have spotted this because I could have asked myself, does the data result in sensible numbers? And this is the first question you should ask yourself when you're doing any kind of critical analysis on your data. Does the data result in sensible numbers? Well, my colleague Willem helped kind of draw this out. If we look at how many of these, what I was thinking, areas were in here, then per pulse I was working out that there were 4 kilograms of pulses coming from a single square meter of land. 4 kilograms of beans from 1 square meter of land. That's a hell of a lot of beans. So I should have been able to spot that that was a bad piece of analysis. The numbers were just too extreme to make this realistic. Actually, if I hadn't to square the numbers and I've realized they were square meters rather than meters squared, then I could have worked out that actually 400 grams were a lot more sensible. But as I dive through this, I started asking myself more questions. I realized my mistake. And then I started asking myself, well, what is the original source of this data? Can we even trust that original source of data? And this is a question that you should be asking yourselves too. Is there any bias built into that original data? Is it something that's inherent in the underlying data that recording it that means I should doubt my analysis? And we should think about this in terms of our business data we collect through our systems, etc. What is the original source of the data, and how is that then reflective in what our analysis is seeing? For instance, are we collecting all the products that we use in the data? Are we collecting all of our customers? Are we only seeing the customers that eventually buy our product, not everyone who looks at it, etc.? If we look at the original data source and realize the biases, then we can start to realize, critically evaluate its quality. And once we've done that, we can start asking questions like, how was the data sourced and treated? Is the methodology transparent? And therefore, can I trust it? Well, in this case, taking the example, then it was from an academic paper. And we could see that the 3 different types of cattle were converted to meter squared per kilogram of protein. So it was meters squared per kilogram of meat that was then converted to 13% protein per kilogram of meat from one study. This was a metadata study. And if we looked at another study, then the other paper compared that to 5.67% of protein per kilogram of meat. Now, those are 2 different ways of attributing it. I don't know whether it was right that each paper did that, but when Clark and Tillman pulled these two papers together in their metadata analysis, then they brought together 2 different ways of looking data and compared it in the same way. And was that fair? I don't have the answer, but it's a really critical question to ask when we're judging. Is this a good source of data? Can we trust it? So we start asking ourselves, in this case, I asked myself, how crude are the measures of meters squared per gram? What is the error margin? Do I need to attribute some kind of error in this when I'm looking at how this data plays out? And am I communicating that error to the end users, or am I just presenting it as fact that beef has this value, pulses have this? Or is there wild swing in the beef measure, whereas pulses is quite accurate? Because the way we present that vastly changes the story and how our users see that end story. I could ask myself, do the aggregation methods used represent the data well? How was the data aggregated in this example? Well, these are the final values that Clark and Tillman in their metadata analysis attributed to each of these different values. But we can actually see just here how those values were created. Each of these dots is a point in the metadata analysis, bringing together that data. And we can see that dairy, eggs are very tightly packed. So we can see that the average works very well. Fresh produce is quite a long, there's a lot of values down here. This grey bar just here is the median. They actually used the mean, which is quite a way higher than where most of the values are being pulled. So these outliers are pulling the mean to the right. Likewise, wheat. If we can't see beef on here because the value is much higher. If I move to beef, look at it on a different axis, we can see that the median for beef is right down here. There's a lot of values clustered just here. Whereas only 1 or 2 of the papers put the meters squared per kilogram of protein so high, which brought the average right up. Now, was it fair of Clark and Tillman to use the mean just here, or should they have used the median of all those different papers? It's a really key question that goes to the heart of how this data is presented to the end user. And as I more and more about it after making my initial mistake, then I realized the answer wasn't as clear cut as even I was thinking it, or it was presented in that data. If we compare the 2 values, then we can see the orange is the median and the blue is the mean. This is fascinating. This goes right to the heart of this data set and casts a lot of questions around how we can use it. Now, I'm not saying Clark and Tillman did anything wrong in choosing the mean over the median, but it does question what is the right answer for data and how do we critically analyze data that's just presented as a single number. It's really important that we ask these questions when we're given any data. So the questions I ended up asking myself was, does the mean truly represent the data? Was the median a better way to avoid the skew? Should we have presented the margin of error in the individual values? And are the end results do they actually matter to the end audience? Sometimes they don't. Sometimes presenting that is really key to giving our audience some level of confidence in what we're doing, and presenting a true ethical view of the data. A lot depends on the audience's data literacy themselves. Can they understand margin of error, etc.? And finally, why are we using this measure? Why even focus on protein? We could have used calories to understand that. Is protein something natural that our audience will understand? Could we have used alternatives? Lots and lots of questions coming from, on the face of it, what looked like 9 rows in a simple Excel sheet. So it's not how we lie with charts, it's how we critically analyze data and ask ourselves questions all the time about the sources of that data in order to present an accurate and correct position to our audience. A few other kind of thoughts on this subject, because I think we're all guilty of doing almost what data visualization tells us to do. I use the examples at the beginning around pre-attentive attributes. Our pre-attentive attributes are pre-programmed to help us spot patterns in data. And I think it's really easy then to fall into the trap of trying to explain those patterns. Here's my colleague, Jonathan Allenby. He produced this plot for Makeover Monday, which shows the energy usage in 10 Downing Street, and he looks at days of the week across the top and weeks of the year down here. And he says, I'm sure these energy spikes in January and February have got a story, but I'm not sure what they are. He's saying there must be a story there because the data is a pattern. And I think we need to just question that and say, is there always a pattern, or could this just be random changes in the way that energy is being used? Let me give you a rather kind of famous example that I always like to laugh at. Here's one particular headline. 10% of Somerset secondary schools are well below average. We want to explain the fact that people are below average. I've seen similar headlines. 50% of schools below average. Of course, 50% of schools are below average. That's the way that averages work. 50% are always going to be below and 50% are always going to be above. The media loves to present this as a bad thing, but that's the way that statistics works. And it's really important to understand that and understand we can't always put stories onto statistics. Here's an example. We're looking at surgeons. This is some made-up data that I just threw together, but surgeons, Surgeon A has had a lot of complications in the surgeries that he's performed, over 110 compared to some of the other surgeons. Let's stop Surgeon A doing any surgery before we can work out the cause of these complications. Well, if we look at the rate of complications, then there's a slightly different story going on. They've all got around 10 to 12% range of complications. Is that key? Should we still stop Surgeon A? Should we get him to learn from Surgeon C? Obviously, 2 or 3% of these complications is still a really high factor that's affecting our patients. Maybe we should look at it. I'll come back to this because here's another example. We're looking at failures in a factory over a month, over 2018. And we can see that the failures peaked in October. Was this something to do with Halloween? Is Halloween to blame for all these failures? Is there something bad happening in October? In this case, this was random data that I threw together. The factory I modelled had a random a number of builds that they had, and they had a clear failure chance, the same failure random chance for every single thing that they produced. And then I threw that into this chart. The same with these surgeons. This is randomly generated data that's got the same chance for every surgeon of having a complication. These patterns are random, and yet our eyes see the fact that surgeon A is different to surgeon C, that maybe there's a story there in October. It's really important that we're aware of the fact that randomness in data can actually, when aggregated, produce some what look like significant results. I've seen the same in the press when we're looking at footballers. Wayne Rooney on goal drought. It's now been 20 games since he scored a goal. Maybe there's a random element to whether Wayne Rooney scores a goal or not. And if you toss a coin often enough, then you will get rows of heads in a row. The same with scoring goals. You will get these barren patches in a random patch. You can't always look for stories. Ditto, this is a Makeover Monday example. London buses are more dangerous for women. Is this the case? This was taken from the number of accidents on London buses. Is this the case? Is it random? Or are more women just travelling on buses? Perhaps more women use buses for whatever reason in London. I don't know, but I think we need to ask ourselves those questions before we put headlines on saying London buses are more dangerous for women. Likewise, this is a similar chart looking at incidents causing accidents and picking out the peaks in these. And it's easy to say, well, what peaks are causing these? Maybe this is just random peaks in the data, and by focusing on them, we're looking for stories that aren't there. So as I finish up, let's look at some tips for responsible data analysis. How can you make sure you're being responsible when you're doing your analysis? Be insatiably curious. I wouldn't have dived into that protein data if I wasn't looking at it. I wouldn't have seen the things I saw and learnt my lessons. Make sure you practice. Makeover Monday and other projects are there in the community to help you practice where it doesn't matter. People can make mistakes about London buses and publish it to Twitter, where they'll get help in seeing what's happening, and maybe we can discuss whether that's a relevant thing or not. Doing that at work is much more detrimental to your career. So practice where it doesn't matter so you can make the mistakes before they do matter. Trust nothing. Have that critical eye where you don't just say, wow, that's amazing. Use your data brain and start to think, is that too good to be true? Do I need to look into this further? When you get a new data set, think about, what does a row mean? What is a row in this data? How's it been collected? What's the overall population of that row? And what's the context behind the way it's being collected? In our London bus data, each row is an accident on a London bus. The overall population is the total number of accidents. It's not the total number of people travelling on the bus. We haven't recorded no accidents. So it's very difficult to draw conclusions about what accidents are happening to which proportion of the demographics. We need that context in order to actually draw conclusions. There's a lot of common myths. If we talk about the limitations in data sets, then we limit the power of the analytics. Sometimes it's easy to brush those limitations under the carpet, thinking that our analysis is more powerful because we haven't discussed those limitations. I say no. We need to talk about the limitations of data sets when we present our analysis. We need to have these honest conversations with our users in order to have a real conversation about data. if we're not being true to the data and we're not presenting it in the best way. Another myth: analysis happens after you have data. No, we can analyze what data we need. We can analyze how we'd like to collect data much sooner than we do. A final myth: the more complicated analysis, the better it is. That's in no way true. We can learn lots and lots of things from very simple bar charts and line charts. We can really dive into data and find things out without needing to present complicated things that may take away from our audience's understanding of the data. Some of the most successful career moments have been, for me, presenting really simple analysis, because that's what our users see and understand. That is me done. We're coming to the top of the hour. There is the facility to ask questions. If anyone does have questions, then I'm happy to take them in the chat. I see one or two thanks coming through, so it's been a pleasure. We will distribute the recording, so we'll make sure that's available if you have colleagues who are interested. I can't see any questions coming through the chat. I don't. It perhaps wasn't a talk that many technical questions or things like that. So if there are any, I'll stay on the line. But otherwise, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next sessions. This is a regular webinar, so watch out for future sessions that we'll be presenting, and there'll be tips on Tableau, on UltraX sessions, and this as well. So you can really find how to use Tableau to learn these sessions. If you're interested in picking up any of the things we've discussed today around data literacy with your Information Lab account manager or with the team here, then please do just get in touch as well. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks everyone. I'm going to close the webinar now. Bye-bye.